I'm June Reith, and you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This time, we're picking up the final part of our discussion of Anarchist Cybernetics. If you didn't catch the first part of the series, I'd recommend pausing this episode and going back and starting from there. As always, thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show.
I mean, we can look at this list of things that like the sort of Desiderata, the things that a good social media platform ought to have, which, I appreciate Swann like writing this down, because it's like, it's not just like, I wish things were better. It's like, I wish things were better in these specific ways, and you can debate them as like good or bad ideas, as opposed to just being airy-fairy stuff. So the first one is it should be a forum for conversation. Certainly I think all social media platforms, except for like maybe like Instagram, would qualify. Like, it's pretty much anything, right? They're all forums for conversation on some level.
Maybe he's gesturing more towards the old school sort of forums, like where it was more considered conversational sort of stuff,
He even says like Facebook style groups and messenger app groups like WhatsApp could fulfill this core function. So it's kind of like I think he just like any many-to-many platform would have this function. So it's like we have plenty of that these days. Direct messaging, so is one-to-one as in addition to many-to-many. Most social media platforms have this. Sharing content with meme or viral potential. Probably all social media platforms have this, right? At this point.
I think he's maybe gesturing more towards the the like function and like reblog on Tumblr, that kind of stuff, where there's like some functionality that helps things. Because a PHP bulletin board forum post was just a post and didn't have any of those kind of viral signals.
Yes, you could hyperlink to it and that was it. Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. If you're looking at sort of like old online media, there were definitely ones that had this and ones that didn't, but I think at this point it's ubiquitous. Any social platform that's going to be launched these days will have this. You could look at like IRC as like another one that wasn't super great for doing this. Because like you couldn't link to conversations and stuff like that, but you look at Slack and you can. So yeah. News feeds with curated and user-generated content. I mean, it's like a big question. Like, what is the curation? Like, how does the curation function? What degree does the user have over control does the user have over the curation? So this is where a lot of like Facebook's really nasty behavior comes in. Public relations function. So like you should have like a one-to-many opportunity to like get a message out there. Which most networks I would say have. Linking alternative and mainstream platforms. So this was an interesting one. Basically, the idea here is that if we make a platform like we're going to do a new independent social network, and it's not connected into mainstream platforms, then it's just going to be irrelevant, right? Because it's just its own little thing. And I actually had some experience with this kind of functionality on Mastodon, when there was one of those big exoduses from Twitter where people were like, we're fed up with this. All the queers are going to Mastodon or something like that. Let's walk out and do our own thing. The connectedness was certainly a feature that encouraged the use of Mastodon. But at the same time, it definitely just like made you realize that like Mastodon was simply an extension of those networks you connected to. And if you actually wanted to do anything in terms of like, self-promotion or getting a message out to the public, you would have to go to those networks or publish to those networks. And so inevitably it just kind of dragged people back across that divide into those networks. So it's not like it's not obviously like a fatal flaw for these like Mastodon to have that, but it is clearly not a solution to like the power of network effects either. Yeah,
I think that this point in particular highlights the kind of huge changes between the early and late internet, right? Like because if you went back and showed this line to somebody in 1997, they'd be like, okay, linking between platforms. Do you mean just hypertext, like hyperlinks?
Yeah.
Because that's linking between platforms was just how the whole damn thing worked. But now with these platforms, the substantive linking we're just talking about is really like, I want this service to like schedule a job that will push to, and like it'll push data to an API on Facebook's end, and their ingestion thing will pull in the JSON blob and then make a row in a database and stuff, that's so different. Like it's these black box machines talking to each other, not like pages being linked between the way people used to surf the web or whatever is kind of totally gone now with these platforms where like Facebook or whatever is like 80% of all internet traffic or something at this point, but we're so beholden to these things we can't entertain, oh yeah, just link to it with hypertext like we always used to, because that's not actually a viable way for this like substantive linking to happen.
Yeah, it's like the replacement of or the displacement of the significance of hypertext by APIs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or the replacement of blogs with Facebook, the replacement of blogs with fucking everything, huge change.
Where it's like, okay, you can interface with this, walled garden that I've built, but you have to do it on my terms and in my language.
It would also mean that like even if you built that bridge, Facebook could just turn off the API keys for you, like trivially. Yeah,
whenever they wanted. Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. For sure. Because like I don't expect that Trump could go on Mastodon and then like publish via a sock puppet account onto Facebook, and that would be like effective in any way. Like I feel like he tried to do that kind of like finagling, and it obviously didn't work. So then a central resource hub, like basically provide kind of like wiki-like information about like self-organization, how to communicate effectively online, how to organize. I feel like this is kind of like inherent to the internet that you could do this, but like, or to the web. But I think like they're sort of talking about like on a portal there would be a link to this stuff that would be prominent and kind of like a similar way to when you go to like a subreddit and there's like the need to know stuff that's on the side.
The sidebar. Yeah. I think on one level, like this, like a wiki is by now like the most trivial case for like web development. Like it's the easiest shit to put together. But I think wikis are kind of a lost art among among the kids, among the millennials, right? And it does show up in organizing problems where like if all of your shit is happening on Slack, it's impossible to like search that or like link back to a previous conversation or to like have durable information, because it's just this swarm of noise. And so I think what he's saying here is like, in addition to having the Slack-alike channels for discussion, also have wiki pages, because those are a specialist function.
Yeah, or like your Slack needs to have like persistence and pinned notes on the channel or something like that. Yeah.
So it's more like the affordances of how these things work, because it's all putting text on a screen, which is pretty trivial. But like the affordances of how the text works are kind of important.
Yeah. The next one is noise and overload filters. So this is kind of like essentially like the function that Facebook has, where they have like one person who curates what does and does not get into like the political discourse, but it's more democratically controlled, I think. It's
Yeah, I guess I sort of interpret it as being more like client facing, that like on your reading end you would set filters to so that you're not like just drinking from the fire hose. And like I guess it relates to the next one, the overuse and addiction warning systems as well.
Yeah, I think this is the filtering one is it's a little bit more collective than say like setting up a filter individually, because there's like voting mentioned here in terms of like setting things up. Then yeah, there's an overuse addiction warning system. So basically just like, similar to the little note you get in a video game saying like, get up and walk around every 30 minutes, or maybe even some games will tell you to do that. Or like the after World of Warcraft came out, where they started adding like a real-time clock to the GUI, because it was like, because people were just losing time and just becoming like, sucked into a debilitating degree to the game. And so like having that reminder of like reality exists and this is the time was helpful for like at least preventing them from being sued over damages to people's minds. But something along those lines of like, yeah, if you like overstimulate through social media, it's probably not going to be healthy for you. So it like, instead of being like, basically this is a warning not to be terminally online. And this is like, I think, getting back to a point that Swann makes, that most organizing is still done offline. And so whatever platform this should be like a supplementary thing to offline organizing, as opposed to all your organizing being like Twitter wars.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a refreshing reminder, right? Like from the author, right? That like this Twitter shit is not real organizing. This is a sideshow of weirdness. And even in this proposed system of like what would a new platform look like, it's explicitly like this is a sidecar to help facilitate real world organizing. This is not the main point.
This is not the main point. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then we have the General Assembly function. So similar to the General Assembly in Occupy. Like formulating grand strategy and maybe strategy through a General Assembly. I have a very hard time imagining how this could happen. Like the closest thing I can think of is like the way that like N Spiral was set up, kind of. Like it couldn't be like immediate. Like there's Twitch chat with like 3 million people in there and they're all trying to talk. That's never going to work. You can't have like a progressive stack with like consensus voting requirements with like, Twitch chat. That's just never going to work. But like I can kind of see like some sort of mediated or staged kind of discussion platform.
Yeah, I mean, something like this integration, but done online. But then, like, I don't know, having spent the last year and a bit more online than ever and doing more Zoom calls and shit like that, that stuff's fucking exhausting and horrible. So I'm not totally optimistic about the capacities for, like, very important organizing to be carried out in, like, 6-hour-long Zoom calls.
Zoom calls with millions of people in them. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely sort of seen like algodonics happening in like Twitch chat, where like people will be like, if you're in a very busy channel, people just kind of like spam like algodonic signals at the streamer, like there's no real content to what they're saying. It's just like yes, no, good, bad, kind of like Beer's little like tourney thing is dial. Yeah. So like I think that like that exists to a degree, but it's clearly very far from consensus decision making. So yeah, definitely we need a very different platform for that. There's a pad function, basically like collaborative document editing.
Google Docs, yeah, built in.
Google Docs, yeah. Hopefully on a different server, but basically the same thing. Memory narrative. So this is getting back to the sort of problem you were identifying with Slack, where things are very ephemeral, and just like having more of a retention of memory so that things could be referred back to, and it wouldn't just be like, whatever the hot take of the day is.
Like, do you ever do that thing where you log onto Twitter and you're like, something happened, but I can't tell what. I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely like walking into a room and there's a whole bunch of shit going on. You're like, what is going on?
It's like I needed to be here for the start of this, clearly.
Yeah, but there's no one to ask what is going on, so like you have to like piece it together through like the context of discussion. Or go to a YouTube drama channel to learn what is the drama of the day.
That's the archive, right? Yeah, that's
the archive. Yeah. File sharing and knowledge exchange, like basically, I guess just not locked down by draconian restrictions.
In my head, that goes in with the wikis. Basically, is that like those are kind of similar concerns? File storage attached to wikis.
Yeah, it's like one of those like PDF repositories that are out there. Procrastination. So it has to have procrastination. Like basically it's like the advice for online community building, where you should have like a fun goofing off channel. Because that's really core to having a community, as opposed to just like everything being all business. Online decision making embedded in offline structures. So like a connection between those things. This seems like kind of like having like the fast paced online, then the slower paced offline as like a control structure to sort of filter out error.
Well, I guess as well, it's like the notion that if you were designing one of these platforms from scratch and it wasn't something that was conditioned by the profit imperative, then it would just, I think a lot of the imperatives would just shake out very differently, where it could actually be designed as a support structure for offline organizing and not be designed as a weird black hole that you go into, which is what Twitter ends up being. Because like its incentive is to be a black hole.
Yes, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Sections open to non-members. So just kind of like sort of public lobbies as like an idea. Like you could just log in anonymously and be in the public space. Architecture for collective autonomy. So
that's facilitating the kind of like facilitating all the stuff that's been discussed in the book so far, basically. Yeah,
pretty much. Like against the profit motive, against ultra individualism, like trying to build constructive relationships that are conversational and robust. Flexible engagement options. So this feels like pretty much what Google Plus did, or what you see with Mastodon, where you get a very like a very detailed level of control over which groups you're in and who sees what. So certainly a thing that has previously existed online, but no longer does, except outside of Mastodon, I guess, and some other minor platforms. Which makes sense, right? Like it's a kind of a privacy thing, and also like a a variety attenuation function. That's good. Responsibility and commitment. So I think this is like essentially connecting your online persona to your offline persona. Like they mentioned like, oh, like if you agree to do something online, like you should be linked to that responsibility, as opposed to it just being like you could just ghost and it'll never get done. Because again, this is connecting to that offline orientation for activism that you were talking about there.
I guess, like, is it also kind of talking about like having a kind of task tracking system, like you'd have like a Jira or a fucking Trello board kind of built into it, and you kind of like, this is what June is doing. This like the outcomes from the previous meeting produced one item that June is supposed to do by the end of the month, and this is kind of present in that kind of social platform. Yeah.
Privacy, security, and data. This is about, just privacy and security, like pretty much not anything we have now, where it's just like, I don't know, anyone can pretty much know anything about you if they have enough money. Easy backup of information. So like pretty much being able to not having to worry about like, oh, the Egyptian government is just going to shut down the whole thing. Then you can't do it anymore. Because like, online platforms were used a lot in activism in the Arab Spring, but then like there's a certain level at which the government can just kind of like turn it off at the source. Yeah, by being like, no, just all the internet is gone now and you can't use it. Okay.
Yeah, the DNS just doesn't resolve anymore,
That's right, yeah. So I think like a lot of these, like some of these things are like things that require significant control of infrastructure in a way that is not available to the left in any way, like anywhere.
Yeah. Like my technician's brain was kind of going off with some of these things, and that like I think I generally agree with the list as these are desirable things. I think we might lose sight of just how expensive it is to run infrastructure like Facebook or Google or Twitter do. Like, it's a lot of fucking money. It's a lot of server time.
Which is why, like, well, it's why, like, Mastodon was, like, a distributed network, right? It was the only way to go.
Yeah. And, yeah, that's that you can share the load that way. Then when you get into stuff like... so, like, one of Mastodon's big problems is that it doesn't have, like, global search. Because it can't. Because it's just a bunch of hard drives scattered all over the internet. And a bunch of really small CPUs that are barely keeping up with the load of actually... doing posts. When you get into stuff like, oh, I also want like easy, fast search of these kinds of systems, which everyone has become accustomed to because of Google, search is really fucking hard and so expensive to run. And that's one of the features that, like, even just in my ordinary engineering work, it's one of those kind of like crash on the rocks kind of features that like people often want, but then turns out to be so fucking expensive and hard to implement. That's very hard to implement in a distributed system as well, because like you kind of have to have a central index. And then also like it crashes on the privacy stuff because like, there's a tension between wanting everything to be encrypted in transit and at rest, but also to have it be available and readable and searchable. And those are just kind of irreconcilable. So I wonder... I suspect a lot of people vastly underestimate the kind of resources required to run something like Twitter or Facebook or Google. Like it's fucking mile after mile of servers, colossal infrastructure. And I don't see the left being able to bootstrap or grow anything like that. It would have to be a kind of distributed patchwork of stuff like Mastodon. But then its patchwork nature means that it's just so limited in so many ways.
That's right. Yeah, and it also is like there are certain things that you simply can't address because state power is against you. So like the internet is built to be a distributed system that can like fail gracefully, right? Like on node per node level. It's meant to be quite durable. But it's still actually quite hierarchical, and it's really fairly easy for the state, if the state can properly identify a threat, it's fairly easy for them to shut it down or to take drastic measures and just do like a scorched earth approach to shutting it down. And that extends also just to sending in cops to confiscate your servers or whatever.
Or even stuff that comes before the level of state interference, where in the last couple of years we've had stuff like, and I'm going to use these examples, and I'm not going to say that these are necessarily bad things that happened, but getting places like Gab shut down or thrown off of their host, or get their DNS resolver to ditch them or whatever. And as much as I love fucking over Nazis, that kind of shit will happen to us, and it'll happen faster and easier.
All the groundwork has been put in place.
And so, you try to bootstrap one of these networks, and just the US government might not even need to go tell Amazon to turn off your servers. Amazon might just do it, you know?
Yeah.
And block your accounts, and suddenly you don't have a domain name, you don't have IP addresses, you don't have servers, you don't have storage, you don't have compute, you don't have anything.
Well, and I think a lot of the approach to these questions is on the left is informed by our extreme weakness. So essentially we have no immediate prospect of owning our own network, and we're just going to be operating on capitalist networks, and we're not really considered to be enough of a threat by the state or these corporations to shut down most of the time. I mean, we've seen exceptions to that in among our friends and whatnot, having their Facebook taken down, even though because it's a platform for left communication. But it's kind of oh, well, we've lost all this ground already, so why don't we just take it from the enemy? Let's just we're never going to get this ground anyway. So if it becomes a place that is hostile to anyone outside of entrenched capital controlling it, that's a win for us, because we can't even contest it.
Yeah, this stuff is so. This is so tricky, and it's something that basically nobody's thinking about, right? That I think the internet, the early internet, was a huge kind of boon for freedom of the press, I guess, or freedom of expression, and freedom of association and stuff like that, because it was this kind of Wild West kind of thing. And then we're now and that was the blog era, that was the hyperlinking between text files era. Super distributed, super easy to get into, and super easy to participate in, super easy to get information, all that kind of stuff. And now the huge majority of internet traffic is now routed through a couple of platforms that have the keys to the kingdom, and they can just kick you off it. During the last couple of years, when a couple of right-wing Facebook groups would get shut down or whatever, but at the same time twice as many left-wing groups would get shut down, the fucking SWP Facebook presence got shut down. That's Britain's oldest fucking socialist party that's still running, and they lost their fucking presence. And that era of open communication, the kind of open communication that is talked about in this book and is necessary for a democratic culture to emerge, and necessary for the kinds of discussions that are needed to cohere larger socialist strategy and all that kind of stuff. I think all that stuff is either under imminent threat or is already gone, and we're gonna really fucking miss it, because we're going to miss the days when Cloudflare refused to intervene in anything political, because once we convince them to intervene in political stuff, turns out they'll just fucking do it to us too, twice as easily. It was a struggle to get Cloudflare or whoever to shut down one fucking Nazi site or whatever. It's not going to be a struggle to get them to shut us down.
Yeah, so this is the problem of the position we're in terms of like having to petition capitalists for political change, and putting them in that position of arbiter, and which is obviously a position of power. It's like coming to the king to get your grievances addressed, So I mean, yeah, it really does just kind of moot a lot of these considerations in any kind of short-term context.
Yeah, especially now that like the anarcho-Bidenist pact has saved the center from itself, and I'm pretty sure like there's going to see a huge fucking purge of all lefty shit like real soon. Easily within the next couple of years. Just see us back on the fucking back foot after it having turned out that the Bernie years and the DSA sort of activity basically conspired to save the Democrats from themselves and keep the party of order in power for a little bit longer. We're gonna get thrown in the fucking bin, real big time.
Yeah, that is the big concern, and I think like it makes sense, like for example, on our Discord, right, which you can join if you're a patron. It makes sense to follow the kind of principles that Swann has laid out here. Like, that's a space that we have temporary control over, and it makes sense to follow good principles and practices in doing that. But we can't assume that that's going to stick around. Yeah. And we've had these kinds of discussions of like, well, like what if Discord gets bought out by XYZ company and they just like look at our use case as error and just eliminate it, right? Or like the same thing that like happened with sex workers on Patreon happens with leftists. It's like you look at something like it's a similar problem, but you look at like Patreon. It's like, okay, well, yeah, essentially there is no alternative because you need to have a large enough corporation that the banks will trust and that international payment systems will interface with, and that's pretty exclusive. It's yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Turns out capital wins all the time,
Like you can't, like, we sort of operate at the grace of these capitalist firms, the good grace of these capitalist firms, and like they just have the axe over our necks, and we can't really do anything about it because the money system is kind of just as, or it's just as much of a hierarchy as it always was.
Yeah, wow, grim.
I mean, I guess there's always Bitcoin. No.
Yikes. I mean, I'll talk about cripplingly expensive infrastructure, Yeah, geez. So, I mean, like, I'm in agreement on the desirability of all these features. I think we're undercounting how weak our position really is, and that's probably saying something because I think we're all kind of aware that we're in a very weak position. I think we might actually be underestimating it by quite a bit.
Yeah. And on a fundamental level of infrastructure control and control of the means of production, absolutely, we're in a very weak position. Yeah.
God, I think I had a sort of thing in my head earlier that like the thing I was thinking of is like I was thinking to myself that the Occupy movement kind of gave a second wind to the Californian ideology in a way, and I kind of wonder if the wind has died down for a second time again, and we're going to start seeing more of the headwinds.
Yeah, it was like when we were talking to Wendy Liu about the techlash phenomenon and that whole sort of thing.
Because, I don't know, that kind of Californian ideology thing of like the enthusiasm for the open networks of the internet and all that kind of stuff, it was kind of a spook back then, and the second wind of it might be similarly illusory, in some ways. I don't know. It's we need to do more thinking on that one.
Yeah, for sure. It's sort of like this question of like, I guess these platform holders have their own kind of pink noise that they're looking for, where there's a sufficient degree of variety in online conversations that's going to drive engagement and therefore get them data. And so they don't want to go so hard that they alienate people from using the platforms. But they also need to like worry about their like PR, state interference, their own personal political views, all that kind of stuff. So like they're really like trying to balance that level of variety, and we're sort of like at the mercy of them considering our discourse being like acceptable enough to include in that like pink noise zone.
Yeah, I guess so. It points back to probably what the author is trying to get at, that like organizing has to be offline first. We really can't afford to lean on these crutches too much, because they'll fucking snap right out from under us.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I mean, you look at the history of like censorship and like revolutionary situations, and there's often cases where like the degree of foment will just like overwhelm the system, and like the censorship just can't keep up. And like I could see that happening, in the future, no question. It's just whether sustained presences in these platforms is going to be ongoing. I'm not so sure about that.
Well, I guess like the thing is that like the workers' movement had a real presence outside of the newspapers, like the circulating pamphlets. So like suppressing pamphlets and newspapers did some damage to the workers' movement, but didn't do vorpal damage to it. Whereas if we're just organizing on Twitter and Facebook, like that's the end, like, and that gets taken away, that's the end of it.
Yeah, because I mean, you'll often have those like revolutionary situations where it's like the police can't shut down the newspapers. Like it's just the publications just get out and there's nothing they can do about it. But that's in like highly exceptional situations, right? Oftentimes they would be shut down. They can do it algorithmically or by DNS or whatever nowadays.
Yeah, we're in a much worse place than the pamphlets and newspapers were. Grim.
I think it's also true that like whenever some kind of new technology for conflict is invented, there will be a responding invention. We have no idea what that would look like, and it probably doesn't look like Mastodon.
Yeah. God, I hope the future doesn't look like Mastodon. Okay, let's get the final chapter. Chapter 8, Organizing Radical Left Populism. A lot of it's a bit of a summary of the stuff that's come before, but then some of it is an account of radical politics since 2011. The electoral turn, failures, reaction, and backslide after Occupy and the Arab Spring, and the essential abandonment of these experiments in participatory democracy. Can we get it back? Was it a flash in the pan, or will it be a prefiguration of society to come?
I mean, I think so. Like Esri has often referred to these political explosions that happen with some frequency as sort of like tantrums, popular tantrums that don't really lead to very much, but they are disruptive of the social environment and like have sort of like a clear historical moment. And yeah, I absolutely expect there will be more of those. Like I am not particularly concerned that we are going to lose the capacity to assemble and disrupt public life on an intermittent basis. Like, I think that's just a feature of our society these days, where things are basically like there's no extra parliamentary democracy happening at all in like any kind of obvious way. It's all underground and like very like slow moving organizational stuff, and then there's a huge explosion, and then it gets pushed back down, it falls apart, it gets pushed back down, and then it happens again later. I think that's going to continue to happen. So I'm not like, I don't think this is like a fundamentally lost horizon.
I think I'm in agreement there. I think the thing I'm concerned with is like the prefigurative and radically democratic aspects of it. Will those turn out to be a kind of something that's will those be a thing that's not picked up again, or will it get picked up again? I guess
I guess I would say I'm cautiously optimistic about that. Like I think so much of what Occupy was like similar to previous public outbursts. It's just it had like some very particular organizational forms that distinguished it, and like it's I guess like I see a lot of continuity leading into Occupy, even though it does have its own peculiarities. And so I think that there's just something about revolutionary moments that will open up that space. And I think that before it gets recuperated, that space is kind of always there. And at least these ideas, I think, are like, while they're largely discredited in sort of left circles, I feel like left strategies, they kind of like come around in circles too. Like it's there's never like a definitive last word on what the right way to organize is. So I still feel kind of optimistic that at least something like Occupy could happen again, whether we're talking about like moving from there into overcoming capitalism. That's like obviously a much less likely thing to happen, but it could. Yeah.
I'm also cautiously optimistic. I hope that whatever comes next preserves these good elements, the participatory democracy, the self-organization, the prefiguration. I hope it doesn't end up that like Occupy is like, I don't know, the Diggers or something from, the English Civil War, where it's like a weird historical anomaly that like is rapidly forgotten and then rediscovered centuries later, that'd be a shame.
Yeah. Definitely.
That's the thing I'm kind of thinking about there, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
But the question then turns to like, given the electoral turn, how to resolve, like, how do we keep this commitment to participatory democracy given that context, given that everything has shifted kind of rightward in the left spectrum, everything has shifted rightward into kind of electoralism and this sort of stuff.
I think that the it's also shifted away from electoralism at this moment. I feel like I don't know if we're on the backswing, but I think we could go towards authoritarianism or more of a kind of a participatory form like this. I think that I would just say that the momentum towards funneling into Labor or the Democratic Party or the SPD or whatever is, I think, ebbing considerably at this moment. I think that it's like, they're like really far into the recuperation stage at this point, and it's kind of like I don't think young activists are going to be looking at that and saying that's obviously the way forward.
Yeah, it's a strange moment where the center has kind of won the day, but you're quite right that like there's an even more palpable disgust at that kind of stuff.
It's kind of like, after the sort of the surge of the civil rights movement, and you had like all of these like black mayors getting elected in America, or people getting elected to like black caucuses in Congress. Afterwards, they were heavily recuperated, and like they didn't go away, but like they also didn't have the same purchase in the public imagination afterwards.
Yeah, so the author brings up kind of two key issues that need to be addressed, in quoting. First, how can anarchist prefigurative politics sit side by side with the new left-wing populism of this electoral turn? Second, what does this mean for how political institutions are structured? Now, if we're on the backswing away from electoralism, these may not be terribly relevant. But maybe they still are, because I mean, I could imagine like either we get a kind of, maybe there's an upsurge again in this kind of participatory democracy stuff, or things go in this, I don't know, like integralist kind of center-right kind of direction, and the kind of the wisdom of the day just becomes that like managing the state and it's kind of, it's like restoration of order is just the only thing on the table. But yeah, I don't know. We seem to be swinging a little bit away from the electoral turn, at least in the sense of like the kind of disgust at its failures by now.
I think that for instance, this talk here about anarchist constitutionalizing. I don't think it necessarily has to really be connected to electoral process. It could just as easily come out of something like Occupy, right? Like it's like in order to make a constitution, you just need to have some degree of power and a group of people to make a constitution, right? Like it's how you get there could be quite a number of different things, right? So like I think that's still a relevant question, right? Like trying to formulate some kind of order that is functional and is not statist, I think is fairly reasonable. Like I can imagine that some kind of constitution would just be implied in any kind of like anarchist polity, because like whether it's written or otherwise, it probably would be written, I would imagine, because it's kind of like a mass thing, and unwritten constitutions tend to be more of a thing you get in like elite societies and like masses interacting with elite societies. So I think it's I think it would, there's still room for that to happen. I could absolutely see just sort of on the basis of like formalizing your system 5 to some degree, right?
Yeah. I was a little kind of ambivalent with this section, right? Because it's kind of framed as like a way of kind of reconciling this prefigurative stuff with the turn towards a kind of politics centered around a kind of like left populism centered around the notion of the citizen, and this kind of like the people versus corrupt elites and popular sovereignty and that kind of stuff. And so the anarchist constitutionalizing is framed as like a kind of way of integrating and reconciling those two things. And I think you're quite right. It's like, it wouldn't necessarily need to be a state sort of thing. But then the example they give is a kind of in Iceland trying to rewrite the constitution after 2008 with a like participatory assembly, and there's this big kind of transparent process. But then that effort ultimately fails because the right get back into power and just fucking shut the whole thing down. And then, but the upside is that it was an attempt at something that was beyond. It was something slightly different from representative democracy. It was at least novel.
Yeah, it wasn't like elected officials coming together to do a constitutional assembly. It was actually by sortition. So yeah, which is novel and is like much more radically democratic, right? So that's cool, but potentially that also failed because it didn't have buy-in from the elected officials who are actually the ones in power. So
it may also have failed because it may not have had like mass support. Like I think for these kinds of things to work, you would probably need mass grassroots institutions that to which these folks are accountable. And I don't know, like oftentimes when you hear like, oh, People's Assembly or this kind of stuff, it's often like it's the state who are calling the tune. It's rarely a like durable grassroots like workers institution that's calling the tune of the engagement. And I feel like that's actually the missing ingredient, is like you'd have to maybe this is kind of running into a similar Bootstrap problem, like similar to what we had with Bernie and such, where like, okay, we're gonna get Bernie elected, and then he's gonna do all the reforms that are necessary for us to have a workers' movement that would have gotten him elected in the first place. Doing this kind of like constitutional sort of stuff might presuppose the kind of grassroots movement that the constitutional stuff would enable, maybe,
I think in the case of Iceland, like, the popular discontent was sufficient that there was something behind it, but the problem is that, like, the constitution writing process itself can be indicative of recuperation and, like, demobilization. So it's like, by the time it's finished, it's not necessarily there anymore. The popular mobilization that would be necessary to push the government into accepting it.
It's been disarmed by then. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very tricky thing, that way. So yeah, I mean, I'm obviously not from Iceland, and I'm, I don't know a huge amount about that period of time. But I did read up on it at the time, and yeah, I think it's very interesting, but I think it was one of those things where every political tendency tried to read their preferred reading of what was happening into it, because it was just like, it's in Iceland, it's so foreign to, like, everywhere, because it's just out in the ocean there. And most people can't afford to go there. So it's very, like, it gets into that kind of, like, utopianizing thing about, like, well, in China, they're all rational, and, like, everything is perfect over there. So yeah, maybe doing some violence to the actual political history in the name of advocating ideas. I think that probably not a bad idea for anarchists to accept the idea of a constitution. They just need to find a way to do it without making it the exclusive domain of lawyers.
I think it would have to be a constitution for the new system and for the new society, not kind of doing like Hobbesian anarchism or whatever. Trying to reform the constitution of the nation state. Yeah, totally. It's a general worry I have about a lot of the stuff in this chapter, is that it kind of some of it kind of signals it's a lot like that kind of problematic national anarchism sort of stuff, where it's like if it's still tethered to the context of the nation state, and it's not, I don't know, some of this stuff presumes internationalism is on the table, but then kind of isn't really foregrounded, which leaves me thinking that it's going to have similar problems to the Occupy thing, where it's kind of formally internationalist, but then if everything is about, like, citizen sovereignty, and, like, as problematic as the category of citizen is, in terms of, because, like, hey, I'm a citizen, my landlord's a citizen, the lady working at Starbucks is a citizen, so is the boss that's feeling her up, and so is the HR person who refuses to prosecute that transgression,
Well, and then just all the people who are excluded from the category of citizen that are part of the society as well, right?
Yeah. So a People's Leviathan as an anarchist initiative, I don't know. But you're quite right that, like, the notion of constitution needs to be like something we take seriously. Yeah. And I think that
in terms of all of the sort of prescriptions or examples or readings in this chapter, a lot of them I think really undermine the sort of, like, militantly, or, like, I don't know, just the strongly partisan anarchist bent of the framing of the book, or the identity of the book. Like, that it's like, actually a lot of this stuff can kind of be read as transitional more than prefigurative, and, like, it's probably more in a kind of gray zone than this, like, purist sort of conception of politics. There's a phrase that keeps recurring here in this chapter, and it's within and against the state, and it's often a quote from John MacDonald, which I'm sure is a phrase a lot of people have uttered. That's Marxist. It's Marxist. I'm sorry, but yeah, it's like, yeah, this is like when it kind of comes to making prescriptions, there's a lot of concessions to sort of Marxist arguments here.
Yeah. Like reforming the state from within and all that kind of transitional stuff, all that kind of like consequentialist stuff that's not entirely imminent, it's not entirely prefigurative, but it's like doing a process that would dissolve the state and get us somewhere else. Yeah, that's straight up classic Marxism. Yeah.
Yeah, in the sense that like Marx was never like entirely in or entirely out on these questions, and like, you know, he recognized that like okay, so like first of all, the thing that many people, including Marxists, get wrong about Marx is that Marx was not in favor of the state at all. He wanted it gone. And it was a question of how to do that, not whether to do that. In terms of the whether to do that, he was in debate with Lassalle. And Lassalle's arguments generally won the day, which is why we associate Marxism with a position that Marx definitely did not hold himself. And so, you know, when we look at what Marx actually thought, this kind of like gray zone, like, well, it's actually like, you know, maybe we can wither the state from within in these like various different ways, and like, you know, all that kind of stuff. Like, it seems a lot more similar than different, and like I don't think we're very well served by dividing this up into like a Marxism versus anarchism question. Yeah.
Maybe we need to be looking at Kautsky Cybernetics, you know, or something like that. If this is where we're going.
Well, it's just like, okay, like we're against the state. We accept that, but like maybe not like everything is going to be prefigurative, because you kind of get into a like you sort of end up putting yourself in a monad when like you when you take that stance to the extreme, where it's sort of like I just need to shut myself off from the rest of the world so that I can exist in the future now.
I need to be pure. Yeah.
It's a kind of purity politics that isn't necessarily bad, but if you take it to a point of like, you know, essentially we're going to have prefigurative practices and we're just going to ignore our connections to the environment, you've like really fundamentally dropped like core cybernetic tenets about like you are an organism in an environment, and that is like fundamentally important to your existence. It's not like this book tends to downplay that environmental side of things, and I can understand that, because if you look at the VSM, it sort of does something similar. But it's always calling back to the fact that like this is all oriented towards existence in an environment, and that's like super important, and kind of requires that the answers we come up with are not purely about like creating an isolated utopia in which like we can gestate a new world, but actually like exist in our environment and not just get crushed.
Does that aspect of anarchist kind of thought seems to have an extremely like rationalist kind of bent to it, right? Where you just kind of conjure the thing entirely in your head, right? And it's all values that are totally separate from context.
Yeah, or it has like a very like long lineage in socialism. This idea of like we will go somewhere where there aren't many people and build a example of utopia. And it's, you know, obviously something that
ex nihilo, you're just gonna conjure it out of the air.
Yeah, these like utopian communities, and like obviously that was something that Marx and Engels argued very strongly against. But I guess like making utopian communities in the middle of major metropoles isn't sufficient, even if they follow the structure of the VSM, but don't have the environmental orientation of the VSM, because it's like ultimately survival of these things matters and principles of these things matter. Like the system 5 matters, but also all the other systems matter.
Yeah. That's it's one of the core things from cybernetics, right? Like the world is sticky and you are involved with it.
Exactly. So I think that's super, super important. And it gets to that idea of continuous adaptation, right? That's really, really significant. And again, like we don't need to fetishize the form of Occupy, right? Again, the VSM is a diagnostic tool, so it's independent of any given organizational form, and so we don't need to say like the VS or the Occupy was the realization of the VSM, and therefore we just need to make another Occupy. That would be absolutely contrary to Beer's ideas.
Yeah. So I think in the last couple of sections, I think there's maybe only one thing I really want to highlight. It's kind of going over this stuff of like how to relate to existing institutions, right? Like he contrasts institution with interaction. Like so, institution is static and controlled from above. Interaction is nomadic and kind of from below. How do you reconcile these things? And again, it is kind of like doing this thing where not insisting on the prefiguration entirely at this point. So kind of conceding that ground that we just kind of we were just talking about. But there's kind of like, I don't know, there's some stuff here that's a bit kind of back and forth, but like, you could have these kind of like institutions and interactions either work independently towards the same goals, like in parallel, or do some sort of hybrid organization, try to mix these modes up. And there's a couple of examples of like, I don't know, like activist mobilization from below that is controlled by an institution above. And one of the examples he uses is like the in Scotland the independence movement and its relation to the SNP as a party, and like it all calls to this like problem of recuperation and digestion, right? Like who's really in control of these kinds of things? Like so, in the independence movement example, it's like the activist movement from below is the interaction mode, and the party is this like institution mode. But like from what I've seen, like it's just unequivocally the case that the party is just the one who gets the last word on everything. Like it's very much the case that the activist base is mobilized and largely controlled by dictates of the party. It doesn't really have an existence independent of that. Like it's very like, we could say, the activist movement is going to go within and against the state in by interacting with the party, but like it's I think it's just total recuperation. Like it's always very clear, and like the SNP is famously insular and like centralized in its control. Like it's an extremely small core to that party, and there's really very little or no like grassroots involvement or democratic kind of control from below in like the branch levels or anything like that. It's an extremely centralized and like paranoid kind of party. Actually, during the Alex Salmond years, and I think even probably now, they had a like thing where they would never keep notes at meetings. Like with these like tiny meetings with the party core, they would never keep a record of what they said because they were that fucking paranoid about anyone leaking anything or finding out anything. It had to be all just hush hush, right? That's not a case where like, the activists are going to march into the institution and control the institution. Like, they're not going to be the tail that wags the dog. And like, just looking around at the evidence in front of me here, they just aren't. And I think Swann does come to that kind of conclusion, right? Like, and it's similar with Momentum and Corbyn, Sanders and stuff, that these attempts at like hybrid models where you go within and against the party or whatever have all largely failed.
Yeah, I think that in the case of the SNP especially, it's like that's very much a case where there is a structural hierarchy that maps onto the functional hierarchy, right? Where like the system 3, 4, 5 are all controlled by a small number of people. And if you're an activist for the SNP and you disagree with their policies, you could leave, but then your system 5 is gone, right? Like you no longer have an identity really as a political actor as in a collective. You just have like I'm pro independence, but I'm not pro SNP. Well, it's like that's okay. You could have that individual orientation because this is recursive, right? But it's not a collective actor in any way.
So the thing that's always missing in these kind of attempts to get inside the system and change it from within, it always seems to be that like the invading force just doesn't have its own coherence that's independent of the thing it's trying to invade.
Yeah, even in like the case of like Momentum, right, where like they tried to build something separate, but ultimately just like labor was going to labor.
Yeah. So like if you climb inside Leviathan's mouth, what's going to happen? Probably you're going to get eaten. It's unlikely that you're going to eat it. Like you're probably not going to digest it. It's going to digest you. And that's especially true when if you are slow moving and it is fast moving, it's going to digest you faster than you can digest it. The only way to make that work is to already have a very strong existence that's outside of its mouth, that is really capable of challenging it. Like maybe a very gory kind of example is like imagine a locust swarm that like bursts through your body and devours you. Like the locust swarm existed independently of you, and that's why it was able to get inside you and eat you.
Yeah, or like flesh-eating disease or like that kind of thing. Yeah,
and that's the only model in which the kind of incursion force can actually win is if it has an independent existence from like an independent platform from which it does the incursion. If your platform is internal to the thing you're trying to invade, it's not your platform. It's the platform's platform. And so that's the big sticking point, right? I'm always going to put down the bet of like who's going to digest who first. And in all of these examples, it's going to be the state or the institution will digest the movement first, because the movements don't have their own independent existence with their own independent systems 4, 5, 3. And thus they're not actually a challenge to it, really.
Yeah, it's more of a like, oftentimes you see with this stuff, it's more that it's more of like an adaptation of the system.
Mm-hmm. Like the DSA, right? Because the DSA is an outgrowth of the Democrats. It's not an independent thing that's doing an incursion into the Democrats. It is a thing that originated in the ranks of the Democrats, right?
Like yes and no. Like it was kind of, it came out of like socialists who were outside of the Democratic Party, but they had a kind of like entry and integration strategy. Like a Harrington strategy. And so it became progressively closer and closer to the Democratic Party. And then...
Okay, so it does have its origin outside. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it has its origins outside, but like as the thing that the DSA has been for most of its history, it has followed the Harringtonian strategic blueprint. And that has always been intimately connected to the existence of the Democratic Party.
So, like, the current iteration of the DSA is, like, it was a rump of the Democratic Party for a while and then became reactivated as a radical thing.
It was kind of like... It was one of these, like, hanger-on organizations to the Democratic Party, more so than, like, a strong part of it. It was like many of these left groups that had sort of like withered away, and it, and then it became reactivated as a like nominally, like continued to be a nominally separate organization, but everything channeled towards a reattempt at the same strategy again.
So would it be too much for me to say that it's basically an internal appendage to the Democrats, or does it still have that incursive?
No, I think that's accurate. It's just like you have to like, I guess you have to like see the Democrats as like being quite a porous thing. that these kind of like hanger-on organizations like the DSA or like the CPUSA, which became just like an appendage of the Democratic Party. Like they exist in that context, but like are very much subordinate to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess maybe my wrap-up thoughts on that are that, like, I think I have a natural skepticism of the within and against the state sort of stuff, right? That, like, again, I'm always going to wonder who's going to digest who first. However, we're not exactly in a strong position to insist on any other strategy, like, as well. So part of what the author here is calling for is a kind of reassessment of where we are, reassessment for anarchists to reassess their kind of attitude towards these things as well. So yeah, maybe in the immediate horizon, these kinds of attempted incursions are the only thing that's feasible, and maybe we can just organize them better so that they do have better independent bases and more viability of their own. That might be the only horizon that's available to us for now.
Yeah, I mean, because I think when I think about, like, okay, you know, this kind of like gray zone strategy of like within the state approach, like I can imagine an approach of withering state institutions, not all at once, but progressively. But I think that's like dependent on not on like marching through the institutions, obviously, because that was a colossal failure with the New Left, because you do just get digested. And not with like this kind of like insurgent perspective of the DSA or the Bernie approach, but like essentially more of a situation where the state has been fundamentally disrupted, and there's a question of how do we provide the services that it used to provide? In that case, there's going to be a lot of people with expertise and connections who are like formerly a part of the state apparatus, and like, you know, kind of the situation that like Beer was in, right? Where it's like there's these people we need, and they're connected, but also like we have to acknowledge that like maintaining them in power is not the goal of what we're doing. But you know, in an even more extreme sense of just like destabilization, right? And at that point, like I think there's this kind of like digestive question from a position of advantage that still comes into it in terms of like, you know, like how do we say like provide public safety without a police department, although like the city has been built with assumptions about policing that are still legacies that exist? Or, you know, how are we going to run a welfare system or a medical system without the state guaranteeing it through like taxation at gunpoint, right? Like these kinds of questions are like really meaningful in any kind of revolutionary transition, and like in many cases it often like ends up falling back to let's just do what was done before, but with like a red coat of paint on top. I think that in terms of addressing that question, this idea of like not everything at once, but like a withering through a sort of progressive digestive process could be useful. I just don't think it's like you go in from an inferior position and then expect to eat the system from within necessarily.
Yeah, totally right. That I really love that framing, right? Because you can't expect to win from a losing position, but especially as we look at like climate change and all this kind of shit bearing down on us, if the state starts to crumble, I mean, which it would not, everything seems to be crumbling these days. A federal distributed network of mutual aid kind of cells or whatever could like kind of digest and absorb the flakes of the state that flake off, as it crumbles.
Yeah. It's like, what's the sort of vestigial forms, right? I mean, like Varn often says that, like, yeah, there's many states in the American Midwest where like there isn't really a state, like the government is incredibly weak, and even their ability to use force is quite limited. Like like compared to the population at large. So like I think there probably already are places in like America where like the state is falling apart, like at a very deep level, and not just like a like, oh, services are bad kind of way, but like this kind of exists in name only sort of situation.
Yeah. And you notice that the roads are impassable, and
yeah, like you can't really expect to go to the government for anything in terms of organization, but also like you don't really expect them to be able to keep people in line either. Because I mean, the core thing about, I've had this conversation with people before, but the core thing that distinguishes what we're trying to go for with communism from the state is not that we won't have any kind of organization, because organization is obviously crucial to our survival and our prospering and all those kinds of things. It's that we won't have an organization that's perpetuated like at gunpoint, right? Like that everything is on at the foundation about who controls the people with the guns, and like there is a minority of society that is in control of that and hostile to everyone else, and parasitical on them. So it's we're still trying to have functional organizations. That's not what we're talking about, which is often the thing that's misunderstood by social democrats, right? Is that oh, like when you talk about a stateless society, you mean no healthcare, you mean like no laws, you mean like, or like, I don't know about no laws, but like no organization at all, just chaos everywhere and everyone for themselves. That's not what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what a fun book.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've both been quite critical of the book, but like at the same time, the parts I appreciate a lot, and I think it largely is in accordance with our thoughts about things. It's just there are various areas where I kind of scratched my head, or I thought this was like a little underbaked, but and it just the general sort of like orientation towards a partisan anarchist perspective, I think hurt the book more than it helped, because I think the cybernetics is good basically.
Yeah and like the core of the self-organizing stuff, like that aspect of the anarchist part is good, but I think it's one of these rare things where I think it maybe suffers for length a little. I would actually like to see a version of this that's twice as long and more fleshed out, more baked.
Yeah, I actually agree. How rare is that?
I almost never say that about books, That's
I think it's almost a compliment, right? Like, there's actually more here to say than you had room to say. That's a rare thing to encounter. So yeah,
I think so. Yeah. I also kind of wonder if I don't know, because I can't help but notice, but like on the cover, it's got like something that's like in the Organizations and Activism series from fucking Bristol University or whatever. And I kind of wonder if maybe that skewed the tone a little, that it kind of, I would like to see a version of this that's more critical and more kind of like troubling of the subject matter.
Sure, right. There's a kind of editorial orientation.
Possibly, yeah. But hey, I definitely want to see more of what what this author can put out. Yeah, cool. Thanks, listeners. It's been fabulous, and thanks for putting up with a fucking 3-month break as well. We were very sleepy.
Yeah, I hope. Yeah, we were all tired after the reading group, the Kentucky Route Zero thing, and the sort of like pre-vaccination phase of the pandemic. And I hope that with this very long discussion of this book, we've made up for lost time.
Oh, it's going to be a 3-parter, I think. Get a massive bang for buck on some of these books, you know, in terms of content. But yeah, it's been wonderful. We very much appreciate having you along for the journey. I think this year, or probably going forward, I think we're on maybe a slightly slower recording schedule. I think we're going to definitely focus on with the understanding that we're pretty tired. We're going to focus on quality more than we do on quantity. But if each of these sit-down sessions turns into like a 4 hours of tape and 3 episodes or whatever, it's not, maybe won't be that much of a slowdown in releases. So that may be fine.
I think it will be similar, just not with the reading group on top of everything else, and maybe spacing out the really big projects that we take on.
Yeah, like, I mean, if we do Entropy of Capitalism, we're going to take a couple of months to record that in multiple sessions rather than trying to bomb it all in one go. So that's, you know, which would end up being better content. So that's all good.
We also know what our next reading is going to be, if people would like to check that out. The book is called Science, Strategy, and War, The Strategic Theory of John Boyd, by Franz Osinga. So not a widely available book, but essentially we wanted to talk about Boyd in a little bit more detail than is covered in this book, in Anarchist Cybernetics. Although we definitely appreciated like mapping the VSM onto Boyd was super cool. Yeah, so if you can find that one way or another, you're certainly welcome to read along. We'll be reading chapter 6 from there, and chapter 6 only. So should be quite. It's a long chapter, but it should be fairly easy to get through.
And we will be joined by C. Derek Varn for that one. Looking forward to that. That'll be good fun, you know. Yeah, and we've been threatening to do Boyd for a while, so we're finally getting around to it, which is very good.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, getting to that environmental orientation we were talking about. Yeah.
He's super all about that orientation. He's like, yeah, it's a fascinating theory because it's the whole observation and orientation parts of the loop are just like, you know, make yourself be made of eyes, you know, is a very big thing in Boyd.
Yes.
Like hyper sensitive and hyper aware of the environment is a big thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, fun. But while you wait for that one, you can follow us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook. We're on all the podcast apps, so like, rate, and subscribe. Do all that kind of stuff. You can go to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit. Give us a couple of bucks a month and get on the community Discord and help support us. Keep the lights on, you know, all that kind of good stuff. And this show is part of the Emancipation Network, the network we've been referring to throughout this whole recording. It's a Marxist podcast network and research collective. So go and check out our sister shows. What the fuck are they? It's been months. I haven't written any of this down. Swampside Chats, Jumpsuit Utopia, Mortal Science, Varn Vlog, and From Alpha to Omega.
That is all. Yes.
I didn't forget anyone.
And General Intellect Unit, the one you're listening to now.
You're already listening. It's fine. They're all fantastic. So yeah, give them a listen and see what's going on. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks again, listeners. It's been great, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.